First off, let me say thank you to all of our speakers today. We're very excited to be bringing this topic to our community stakeholders and really bringing them a timely, addressing a timely subject. Our speakers today are providing information on their services and have dedicated their time today to introducing themselves and letting us know a little bit about the great work that they're doing. Thank you also to our presenting sponsors, Minnesota Transportation Institute and Transform. Without their help, Alex and I would not have the support that we needed to really bring to you this wonderful event at the caliber that we like to bring information to our members. Today we have a packed agenda with a lot of great information and a lot of insight into what's going on in the field of mobility. First off, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Alex Shore of Catalyze SV to tell you a little bit about our first speaker and a little bit about the topic that we will be discussing today. You're all welcome to engage with us using the chat function along the way. And we'll tell you a little bit more about the event today. First off, thank you so much to CSV leader Carlin Black. Without his insight into mobility, we wouldn't have had the inspiration for today's event. And thank you so much for promoting this event to the San Jose Chamber of Commerce, AIA Silicon Valley, Canyon Snow Consulting, the San Jose Downtown Association, Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition, and Spur. We love partnering with our nonprofits and other associates in the field to really bring these resources and information to community members and stakeholders who are interested in topics around development and interested in joining conversations to really build collaborative solutions to some of the challenges of developing in Silicon Valley. Just a couple of things. We were hoping to have a translator today, but it seems like Imelda is unavailable. Thankfully, Zoom has a great feature where transcription is available in Spanish. So anyone who does need that service, please feel free to reach out via chat and we'll go ahead and turn that on for you. We're also recording this on Facebook Live and YouTube. And so everything we discussed today will be available following the webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. Each presenter is going to have 10 minutes to discuss their services. Following that, they will each have 5 minutes for Q&A. Along with the chat function and the Q&A function on Zoom, I will be sharing a link for an external poll shortly. This will allow you to open it in your phone or open it separately, so you don't have to switch screens on Zoom so much, but that's completely up to your preference. We will also be having a final Q&A portion at the end of today to discuss the topic at large. So with that, I'll hand it off to Alex to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Rocio. Thank you for so many community members, 37 and counting, for being here tonight, today actually. It's so good to be with all of you on such an important topic. We're really, really grateful to have some incredible presenters with great products and companies that could be hopefully really helpful. And Rocio, if you want to go to the slide on the background on why we're here today, I wanted to just share a little bit about that. Many cities in Silicon Valley are considering reforming how much they mandate cities to build when it comes to parking in new developments. And car parking, we know, takes up a lot of space and has a lot of positives, but also some challenges. And so a lot of developers are talking about how can they build maybe less parking and what would be beneficial about that. And so we wanted to bring the community together to talk about some of the alternatives to parking. That's why we have these great companies here today to showcase their products and their services. And we know that that's especially important because a lot of you, whether you're developers or community members, might be tracking the fact that the city of San Jose is considering making these reforms in the next couple of weeks, coming to the Planning Commission on June 8th, and then the City Council on June 21st. So big votes coming up about this. We're going to be inviting our members and stakeholders to come out and participate in those conversations. If you are interested in getting those action alert emails from us, you can sign up at catalyzesv.org/engage, and we will send you our thoughts on it, to help encourage you, even in just 15 seconds, to click a couple buttons, and you could immediately be talking to the city council, sharing your views on what you think about parking and parking reform. So we're really, really grateful that you're all here to hear about this discussion and these products. Hopefully it'll make everyone realize, wow, there are other ways of getting around, and these great, innovative, groundbreaking companies are helping think through that. So in the meantime, we also want to hear from folks in the development community. And we've got someone who's been working in development a long time here in Silicon Valley with a lot of experience, who, like Catalyze SV, is tracking this issue, and we wanted to invite Eric Schoenauer from the Schoenauer Company to share some opening remarks, give some more context about this policy vis-a-vis San Jose, and how it could positively or in any way impact the development community. So thank you, Eric Schoenauer, for being here today. Eric's going to say a few words, and then Rocio's going to take things back over and introduce you to the main event, our speakers.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for Catalyze SV for having me, and for holding this discussion on what, on a macro level, is a very important issue. When we talk about climate change, we all know that the transportation sector is among the largest contributors to greenhouse gas in our state, in our country, and around the world. And so there's going to have to be a way to move away from fossil fuel vehicles, and especially the reliance on single occupant vehicles. So that's a very critical and big goal. So it's great today to learn about some companies with new products that can help us move in that direction. I wanted to give you just a sense of what the development community thinks about when these topics come up, to give some perspective to the conversation. First of all, I represent dozens and dozens of development projects and development companies, and I have for over 20 years. And developers are generally not altruistic organizations. They have a very focused business model and a very focused formula on how they do their business, and they don't happily digress from that approach. So when cities contemplate new policies, whatever they may be, there is a lot of consternation in the part of the development community, and a lot of worry about how that's going to play out. And so when it comes to the topic of parking, developers have, they're sort of caught in the middle, in that they have people who fund development that have particular formulas for the amount of parking they want for a particular use, whether it's retail or office or residential. And the underwriters of those organizations are very formulatic. So if you don't provide, the 2.7 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of office, then they're not going to give you the money to build your project. If you're not going to provide the 1.2 spaces per apartment, they're not going to give you the money to fund the project. In addition, on that side of the ledger, you have end users, right? You have retail stores that have formulas about how much parking they need to support their customer base, and other tenants, small business tenants, retailers, who also have either a real or perceived need for a certain amount of parking. So the developer gets this messaging from the people who finance development and prospective tenants of wanting a certain amount of parking. And then on the other side of the equation, the developer doesn't want to build any more parking than is necessary because it's really expensive. I mean, a parking spot in today's modern urban development costs anywhere from $40,000 to $90,000 per space, depending on what kind of structure it is in, is it below grade, et cetera. And so, no developer wants to build parking they don't need because it's extremely expensive. And then, of course, development gets approved by cities, and progressive cities like San Jose have a lot of policies about reducing reliance on vehicles, reducing parking, promoting alternative types of transportation, and promoting walking and mass transit. And so the developer is playing this balancing act of all of these sort of competing interests, and are trying to navigate the waters. And in the end of the day, when it comes to new city policy, I think there's a few considerations that developers care about. One is whatever's being mandated in that policy, and in this case, it might be new TDM type measures. How expensive is it going to be? How expensive in upfront costs, infrastructure costs within the building, and how much space is it going to take? Whatever it might be, because right now we're living in a time where construction costs are at record levels, and if there's a policy that's going to increase those costs, that's a concern for developers. And space is precious as you try to fit all the things that the city and the community want: retail, parks, open space, dense housing, and then now potentially space for TDM operations. It's a balancing act. So those are the things that developers will look at in any pending policy, and any product that's being promoted as a solution is what is the cost, both upfront to get started, and then the ongoing operating costs over time, because those have to be paid by somebody. And then lastly, what developers are concerned about is projects that are in the pipeline. So when you do a development project, you make a decision to green light a project based on the policies that are in place at that time. And if down the road, months or years, the policies are going to change and the rules are going to change, that can put a project in a very bad position. So in the spirit of being reasonable, any policy update should have a provision, a grandfathering provision for pipeline projects, so that we don't unnecessarily punish a project that's been working with the city and the community for a while. And then finally, I'll just say that the more innovation we have in providing transportation alternatives that are part of a TDM program, and companies that provide those measures, the better. I mean, the more ideas, the more innovation, the more companies we have providing techniques that development projects can utilize to meet the goals, the policy goals of the city, and ultimately the bigger goal of saving the planet from complete destruction is important. So these kinds of discussions are great, and I look forward to hearing the presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. And in case you didn't see in the chat function, I also want to thank Ed from the city of San Jose, who's working really hard on this policy. And if you're going to be engaged in the next month or two on it, you'll definitely be hearing wisdom and insight from Ed. And we're grateful that he's here to listen to and maybe learn from some of the companies that are presenting. So thanks, Ed, for being here. I'll turn it back to Rocio.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ed, Eric, and Alex. We really appreciate you setting a little context for our conversation today. Our goal is to really bring these resources to the decision-making community, the public stakeholders, private stakeholders, and like you said, bring them innovative ideas to kind of solve these problems and these challenges that you mentioned. Really appreciate you providing a little insight into the developer mindset as we kind of dive into these topics. First off, with our speakers, we have Colin Hughes. Colin is the Senior Policy Officer of Transit Bikes and Scooters with Lyft. He is going to be sharing a little bit about their resources and their services. And I believe he also has a presentation for you. So Colin, I'm gonna go ahead and ask you to unmute. Perfect. And if you have any trouble sharing your screen, please let me know. In the meantime, if anybody in the audience has some questions, you're welcome to submit them via the Q&A or the link that you all received, and we will ask those to Colin once we get to the Q&A portion. All right, Colin, you're up.
Right. My screen should be popping up, visible to you all. Can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Let me just close a few tabs so I can, just want to make sure I can advance. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you for the introduction. It's really nice to be here and to be speaking with the development community. My name is Colin Hughes, and I manage the transit bike and scooter policy and government relations for Lyft. And most of you probably know Lyft and you think about cars. That's actually not very related to my work. Lyft is actually also the largest bike share provider in the US and a major provider of scooters and micromobility. You may also be surprised to know that you can also find real-time transit availability in your Lyft app. And the reason for that is that Lyft is really not kind of committed to one mode or the other. The idea that we're pursuing is to make the world's best multimodal app. We want to be able to go to kind of take, especially to take on the car ownership model. And so all the costs that go into owning your car, not just buying it, not just filling it with gas, but also the insurance and the maintenance, and even all the way down to the time you spent circling around looking for a parking spot. We're in the business of providing an app on your phone that can give you not just an alternative, but multiple alternatives. So you can right size, hey, if you're only going 2 miles, no need to get a car. Why don't you hop on one of our scooters or our e-bikes or our pedal bikes? You can right size the mode and the option to the trip you have. So we really believe the future is multimodal. The vast majority of trips in this country are under 5 miles, and a huge portion of them are under 3 miles. And so that's really where, walking, biking, scooting, and transit really shine. And we operate a bike share system in San Jose. It's called Bay Wheels. It's also throughout 5 other communities in the Bay Area. We have a large system in San Francisco, as well as the East Bay that covers Berkeley, Emeryville, and a good portion of Oakland. And so Bay Wheels is operated by Lyft on Lyft's vehicles, but it's through a public-private partnership with each of those communities and MTC, the Regional Transportation Commission. And Bay Wheels riders, we just did a survey. We see that 42%, almost half of them, don't own or lease a personal vehicle. So we see that, for folks who are existing in a car-free lifestyle, who wouldn't need that parking spot in your development, many of those folks are using Bay Wheels on a regular basis. We see that many of our users use it very frequently to connect with public transit. Bike share kind of works almost as an extension of public transit in that way, making it a 5-minute kind of commute to the BART station. You can cover a lot more ground in 5 minutes on one of our e-bikes than you could just walking. So it's kind of an extension there. And also about, also 42% of our riders, they said that micromobility enables them to not own a vehicle. So, we have a lot of people reporting that this has been a really helpful service to them. We have e-bikes in San Jose and San Francisco. The e-bike especially has been wildly popular. Throughout the Bay Area, we see that e-bikes are preferred by our riders 3-to-1 over a classic pedal bike. And so we also see that the average trip distance in the Bay Area of a classic pedal bike is about 1 mile, but our e-bikes, it's over 3 miles. And once you get over 3 miles, you're talking about, you can use that mode for 40% of the trips of an average household. So really an effective mode. But let's just get into a little bit of how bike share can work as a TDM strategy. we've seen that there's been various studies. Capcoa, estimated that 7% of bike share users are shifting from private vehicle transport. Fair and Peers has done VMT reduction studies based on Minneapolis. We actually think those are much higher here in the Bay, where the weather is a little bit better. And in Boston recently approved bike share as a TDM, as a strategy in their TDM plan. And so you can see on the right side, they talk about what bike sharing is. This is cut and paste from the city of Boston's TDM plan. You see they use a point system to figure out, how many points a developer's TDM strategy would get, which impacts then the amount of parking required. And so they've, having bike share on or near your site in Boston directly translates to fewer parking spots that you need to build. And we're seeing more and more cities move in that direction. So, and obviously when it comes to space, I heard, some discussion of space is another important factor. We see that, obviously parking takes up 75% of street space. Oftentimes it's undercharged. It's kind of subsidized to the public, and that can be, brings other issues of, too many cars, not enough parking because it's not priced for the demand. And in the Bay Area for Bay Wheels, we are working with developers in several of our communities. So we have, when we have agreement with the operator, which is Lyft Bay Wheels, and the city and the developer, we have installed bicycle share stations, Bay Wheel stations, near new developments for their TDM purposes. We just had some discussions in Emeryville in recent weeks. We've had several bike share stations installed in partnerships with developers in Oakland in this quarter. Usually in these situations, the cost of the station, the capital cost of the station and its maintenance are paid for by the developer. Occasionally there are grants or public funds that can be used for that. And our stations are about 7 feet by 50 feet to accommodate 10 bikes. 10 bikes would easily serve, up to 100 trips per day coming and going out of the station. Our stations are solar powered, so we don't need any trenching to hook it up to a power source. They come and they can just be dropped right onto the pavement in the approved location. They don't need any drilling. When the agreement is there and the alignment in terms of what it can bring and whether it fits the site is all set, the installation can be pretty quick and pretty painless. And so if anyone here is interested in following up on that and wanted to discuss a site, you can certainly contact me. I'm just realizing my thank you slide didn't make it into this, but my email is Colin Hughes, COLINHUGHES @lyft.com. And we can set up a conversation where we would talk about that. And that's about all I have for you today. Are we answering questions now,
Yes.
Rocio? Okay, yeah.
Yes, and I would like to let everybody know that Colin may not be here for the end of today's presentation. So if you have any questions for him, please make sure to ask them now. We will be sharing his contact information. So those of you interested in reaching out to learn more about their services can connect with him outside of today's webinar. I definitely took a lot of notes while you were talking, Colin, so I can ask you some questions. But if anybody in the audience would like to submit questions, that would be appreciated. Yeah, somebody here mentioned that they noticed that the Bay Wheels in Berryessa was installed last Friday, so there is attention from the community on your progress. One question that I had for you is, if you're familiar with how the city of Boston was able to include this as an approved TDM plan, were there any challenges associated with building that relationship? And do you have any advice for us in attendance today on how to help support those potential relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wasn't involved in Boston's move there. My understanding is they were undergoing kind of like a renovation of their TDM planning, and we're trying to keep a very open mind as to what are all the different options we can deploy that we think will add up to a decreased demand for parking and will give residents of a new development, or say if it's commercial development, the workers there, that will give them access to the mobility resources they need through different modes. And I think there's a real emphasis in Boston and a lot of other communities for this to be multimodal. So not just necessarily transit, but bikes, having it, making sure that there's access to transit, but also bikes. A lot of cities are even including scooters in that, and then also the mixed uses in the neighborhood that are so close that they don't require a car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a very interesting data point, right? Where you mentioned about the 3 miles average, which I think is a significant for the electric bikes. We do have a question from the audience. Susie asks, is there a typical cost for the capital and maintenance for a bay wheel station? Can you give us a range? I'm sure you can't give us a very precise cost, but what is your sense?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the size of the station that we put in, and it can be a little bit different depending on like the types of. We have a couple different types of stations, but like our typical station, which would be oftentimes in quite a busy area, can range from say $50,000 to $100,000 in terms of capital. Maybe not quite 100,000, but 50,000 and up a little bit. And then the maintenance, it depends also on the jurisdiction. The maintenance for our stations is required by the city. So if the requirements are have quite a bit of maintenance, regular cleanings and things like that, that can be $10,000 to $20,000 a year. And so that's a ballpark. And that's for our classic stations. Again, the stations you would see certainly in the highest use areas. In some cities, we are piloting now these what we call lightweight stations, which are much more simple. They don't have electronic or moving parts. They work very well with our e-bikes, which have a lock on the back. And so this is more like a cross between a bike share station and a typical bike rack. And those are significantly lower in cost.
Okay, thank you for that clarity. That's interesting. I'm surprised to hear that the e-bikes can be a more affordable option for developers. I think it's also very interesting that it is solar powered, and so some of the, as you mentioned, excavation doesn't have to happen. Another question I had is, what is the typical turnaround on a construction for one of your stations?
So that can be very quick. Usually it takes longer to go through site analysis with the city and get the permit and handle all the agreements. But once we have all that in place, actually what we do is we load up a flatbed truck with the station, and that has like a small crane, and we drive up and drop it into place. And it's really the actual construction of a station is very quick. It's really kind of a plug and play, but we don't even have to plug it in.
Mm-hmm. And can you, I know that it seems some, bikes are a good alternative for people that need to get there for that extra mile or get to other transportation options. Do you have any information about who the clients are? What kind of, is it the families? Is it mostly single riders? What is your sense of the population using your transportation options?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I actually have that data. Let me quickly pull open One thing where we did, Lyft does do a demographic survey every year. And so we have some good data on that. I'm just trying to see if I can find that. And in the meantime, I saw John Brazil had asked about our low income program. So that's also a function of it. Maybe I can speak to that while I'm looking for the demographic data. So we do also offer a low income program. It's income qualified. Basically, anyone who is on public assistance for housing or utilities or any other matter like that, if can qualify to get significantly about a 85% reduction in the cost of bay wheels. So we really try to make this work for all income levels. As John pointed out, San Jose does have a high proportion of users relative to the rest of the Bay Area that are members of that. And so that allows you it's free for your membership is free for the first year. It's $5 a month after that. And once you're paying that, you then qualify to get unlimited 45-minute rides on our pedal bikes, which we call the classic bikes. And then you also get our e-bikes at a significantly discounted rate, like about an 80%, 85% discounted rate. And so we've seen strong uptick and usage of that membership in San Jose and across the Bay Area, especially as we're emerging out of COVID. And I wasn't able to find the stats sheet right now, but what I can also say from what I recall of it, at least in 2020, the average income of a Bay Wheels user was around $55,000. So that's significantly below the median income in the area. We do see that there is, I believe, the usage is a little bit like, we do see a little bit of a gender imbalance. And so I think it's 40% of users identified as female, whereas around 60% identified as male. But that was a little bit better than what we saw in the usage of a private bike. So it seems like, we haven't solved that gender gap, but we've made a little bit of progress in terms of the bike share bikes being available to more people. Has improved the gender gap a little bit there. So, we look at those as positive trends. I believe also the average age is around 30. So, we see that as, pretty good midpoint. It's not like our average age is 22 and we know that, that would indicate it's not serving, very many folks who are older than that in the community. So, we do think that it's been a pretty good mode for serving lots of different communities, and also one that has been equitable. So we see that it's popular with lower income folks, et cetera.
Nice. Thank you so much for that. I'm happy to hear that you've collected data, as Eric mentioned, data on usage, and particularly about parking and mobility is a little difficult to capture. So that's definitely encouraging. I think we have maybe time for one more quick question. Bayoshan asked in the chat, he observed that Santa Clara has a good electricity grid. And so wanted to know if Bay Wheels has a station in Santa Clara. How much of a factor is that in your selection process?
So really, when we're looking at station siting, the primary factors are going to be demand oriented. Like I said, our current stations, we are looking at electrifying some stations so that they would automatically charge our e-bikes, but we haven't done that in the Bay Area yet. That's really a pilot program. Our stations are solar powered, so the electricity grid is not a factor right now. But really what we're looking for is places that are going to have demand. So places that have high density. So there's lots of people living and working around the bikes, mixed uses, so that there's people kind of coming and going all day, because there's some residential, there's some maybe nightlife, there's some professional businesses that are open during the day. Those are all the places that kind of bike share brings the most value to, because we see, you know, frequent usage throughout the day, lots of turnover of the bikes, lots of utility for the people around it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all of this great information, Colin. There are a couple more questions in the chat if you'd like to stick around and answer those there. We're so happy that you were able to present today, and we're available today for a few Q&As. As we mentioned, Colin will not be able to stick around all the way till the end. So if you have any more questions for him, I definitely encourage you to ask that in the chat or ask him directly via the chat. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Let me share my screen a little bit. And then he'll be able to share his presentation. So now we will be talking to Paul Gampgard. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And
Jampgard. It's good old phonics.
Director of Infrastructure Planning and Urban Solutions at Glideways. Thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to share with us today. As a presenter, you have access to share your screen, so you're welcome to share slides or any information you'd like.
All right, I've got a few slides here. Happy to join you today. Are you seeing the big picture of a Glideways vehicle?
Yes.
Wonderful. Good. That was the idea. I want to begin by saying that our company was conceived with an aspiration of trying to provide what we felt was the kind of mass transit the 21st century really deserves. We've seen through the years lots of things that were developed in the last 200 years, evolving and growing basically out of manageable scale, both in terms of their size, their cost, and their ecological footprint. As you can see here, it's become just too expensive to build. Anybody who's tracked the build out of the BART system or any of the light rail systems, or even BRT, are surprised by how much that even costs. And it requires more and more public investment for them to actually run and be built. And we believe it's possible, given the certain set of technologies that have come to fruition in the last decade or so, to be able to kind of change this completely and effectively create what amounts to a new paradigm for mass transit. And in fact, what we're really going after to make that possible is addressing the issue of aggregation. Aggregation really is this assumption that if we put more and more people into bigger and bigger vehicles, then we get efficiencies. But as the cost and size and all of these factors I just mentioned demonstrate, that's not necessarily true. And what's changed effectively is the fact that now we can use autonomous technology to shrink those vehicles to dedicate each ride to each individual passenger. It really flips the aggregation model on its head, and we refer to it as disaggregation. And it's possible with a few things we put together, which really constitutes an overall system. It is a new system of mass transportation that we think basically delivers the promise the 21st century has of something that's financially and ecologically sustainable. It's flexible and small enough to go where we need it to go, when we need it to go, and become a much more equitable system than the hard choices of the last model have forced us to make in the past. As you can see, it was a small vehicle, but what's necessary for those small vehicles to operate successfully and deliver the high capacity true mass transit requires is dedicated space. But at only 5 feet wide per lane for our vehicles, that really doesn't amount to much more than a bicycle lane kind of scale. Those vehicles operate in a protected space, that dedicated lanes, so they can do their job of delivering high capacity. What also results from that, by requiring less space, it costs much less to build. Instead of carrying multi-ton kinds of vehicles and creating much larger stations for people to access the system, the result is an infrastructure that is more akin to bicycle lanes and bicycle paths and bicycle bridges and pedestrian scale construction than the massive things that we're used to with trains and freeways and things like that. And so these amount to effectively a system that integrates the idea of the small scale vehicle, allowing us to operate and control this system, allowing the autonomous vehicles to guide their path through it, while at a high level, we orchestrate a fleet that basically responds and delivers the kind of experience that will entice people to leave their private car behind. And that really is the proposition. How do we combine the scale and capacity of a mass transit system with effectively the user experience to allow people not only to kind of get a vehicle on demand in a similar fashion one would do to summon a vehicle by a Lyft or Uber that we've all become used to, but also the kind of features that allow people to have a comfortable ride, one that suits them, whether it's the space necessary for your own personal mobility or the ease for ADA accessibility for the widest spectrum of users in the community, to even be able to select the lighting, music, and HVAC and heating and cooling conditions you like. All of these things are possible when we dedicate each individual ride to each individual person. Just to recap some of the sort of like the implications of this smaller vehicle. The vehicle at only 1 meter wide requires these smaller lanes, and this kind of construction can be executed not on site over years, but instead can facilitate the state-of-the-art techniques being developed for construction to be able to prefabricate lots of these elements, accelerating the time that it takes to actually put a system in place, all of which lead to much lower costs for the capital in front. For the developers in the audience, what this also implies is the possibility to expand the system at a low incremental cost to the capacity that people are being able to access. Not only can we do these systems as shown here in these diagrams sort of on ground, which is very cheap, we can actually go in a cut and cover system where we need to allow cross traffic to go across the top. We can go a little bit deeper as a bored tunnel for longer stretches, also still carrying that very high capacity, or other instances we can go up in the air. All of these things can be combined into a single system and have really responding to local conditions as they warrant. And then lastly, the one I think is most interesting to people who are building buildings and trying to connect their tenants, whether they be commercial tenants as an office destination or residents, they can actually bring these systems into a building. The vehicles are small, they're clean, they're electric, and they're quiet. They basically have a loading capacity requirement comparable to that of a scissor lift. And so they actually can run across the loading of a typical building without any augmentation to the structure itself. So it offers a kind of connectivity to a mass transit system that heretofore has never really been available. By being on demand, the vehicles basically allow for a much smoother experience as it engages and utilizes the wider existing mass transit resources available. So you can basically leave when you want from the office if you're going to make this connection to get over to the Caltrain station. And it basically allows a much more fluid experience from one mode to another. We really want to embrace the idea of enabling this 15-minute city concept, the ability for us to walk, bike, and glide just per your own demand, your own capability, and the given changing conditions surrounding. So you might bicycle in during the morning, but take an Uber or take one of our vehicles in the evening. But it's flexible to what you want to do. Sort of clarifying how we can integrate that into buildings. You can see the infrastructure can be orchestrated to actually enter into buildings. The lobby image down at the bottom, or the bottom left corner, actually is a concept we developed for the Denver International Airport, where the vehicles actually come up directly into the concourse. So you could walk directly from the gate exiting your airplane to get onto a vehicle and then make your way back to the main terminal. But all of these that really are emphasizing that the incremental cost of building this is much smaller for the capacity, the ability to move lots and lots of people than anything out there today. And being small, quiet, and clean, they actually can be orchestrated into any number of different environments, not just major corridors through town. We're a new company, but we're moving along very quickly in our development. This is a facility out in Concord called Gomentum Station, where people are developing different kinds of autonomous vehicles. We have a dedicated track out there where we're expanding our fleet as we go. And right now we're undergoing testing that is leading up to an application in the city of San Jose for an RFP that was issued 2 weeks ago. The RFP is to provide a connection between the Diridon train station and the Manila International Airport. But beyond that, the city wants to see a system that can be deployed as a mass transit system throughout the community. First phase following that people mover application will be one down Stevens Creek Boulevard. And we've been effectively working with the city to make sure that we've got the resources and the capabilities to answer that longer application. And so we're busy preparing our response to that RFP. I'll give you a few teaser images related to that. one of the concepts we're developing and we'll kind of refine as we go forward is how we might be able to provide service not only to the airport and to Diridon, but also potentially to provide service to the park here at Guadalupe, to provide more people, more activity, a stronger presence for the city in this park, to make it much more of a green centerpiece for the city rather than an empty space that's overlooked. As you're probably aware, the big developments going on with around the Diridon train station with Google are something that we're also tracking to be able to integrate our system into it. You can see the small scale footprint that our system would place into a corridor there, and know that the capacity of our vehicles and our system effectively is the equivalent of a freeway. So again, this really illustrates the reduction of space and resources necessary to provide that high capacity that really constitutes mass transit into a much more blended, pedestrian-oriented environment. There's another concept of how we could be reallocating space across what was traditionally an automobile-oriented kind of boulevard in the United States, and make it much more people-centric, much more pedestrian-centric, and still provide the kind of connectivity that people want.
Awesome.
And ultimately, it's about the individuals making a choice. And that's what we want to be part of. So that's what I have for you to share today.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really wonderful visuals, really helped us kind of understand and comprehend all of the innovative progress that you guys are making. I definitely have some questions that I jotted down, and we can dive right into the Q&A portion. People would like to submit questions. Please do so with the Q&A here or one of the other links. We have a question already from an anonymous attendee. Is there a reason that they aren't on a rail? Like, why do they have wheels? Is that somehow less expensive? So a little bit more details about the actual technicalities of it.
Sure. No, one of the, we can operate with, it effectively is rubber tires on pavement. It's a very simple, low cost kind of system to do. It makes it cheaper to deploy in the short term. But thinking in the long term, we fully realize that level 5 autonomy, the ability for these vehicles to navigate the open road and all the complexities of it is around the corner. It's not tomorrow, but it's around the corner. And when it is as reliable as the other kinds of basic autonomous technology we've got in there now, we can leave this system and integrate directly to front doors. And what that affords us then is the kind of coverage that level 5 aspires to, but also the capacity that this dedicated infrastructure provides. So it's really a future-proofing strategy that we've implemented, a rubber tire on road kind of configuration.
Nice. My question is a little more along the financial way, similarly to some of the answers from Liz. I know that you mentioned that you had applied for or are preparing to apply for an RFP through San Jose. And so that is a public stream of funding for your projects. What do you envision, what role do the developers play in helping launch one of these rails or helping connect these infrastructures?
I'll back up a half step to answer that question. And part of it is the fundamental kind of objective of this is to put behind us the absolute dependence on public funding for public transit to take place. Our model is such that we have we can cover our costs with fare box returns. And so we have a private business model that does not rely upon public funding to get going. We might need it in the beginning in some of these first projects, but our long-term goal is for these systems to be self-supporting. And in doing that, we can bring private capital to the case. Now, the role of developers, of course, will be the ability to be able to kind of join in a stakeholder planning process to identify interest, to be able to provide some level of ridership. And this is where the trade-off between parking and connectivity to other transit comes in. This fits into an overall community strategy of TDM balancing. And so that when there's interest expressed by development to be able to kind of commit to a system like this, that gives confidence to the community to support our build out. And then we can make those kinds of trade-offs away from parking dependence.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarity. We have another question from an attendee. What are the operating speeds for the Glideways vehicles?
Well, one of the things that happens when we have a dedicated space is we leave the You leave your station and you do not stop until you get to your destination. We've eliminated all of the stopping necessary in traffic and cross signals and things like that. So by traveling at 31 miles per hour, we are faster than anything through an urban environment that exists. The average speeds of automobiles or buses or things like that are certainly below 30 miles an hour through an urban environment. And so we find that this is sort of more than adequate to kind of beat the competition, so to speak, in terms of convenience and comfort. And by keeping that speed low, the energy consumption is much lower as well. In fact, in many locations where we deploy it with a solar panel system to provide electricity for our system, we can actually operate at or near a net positive carbon footprint. And so this is, again, something appropriate for the 21st century and heretofore impossible.
Yes, definitely sounds like it. We have another question from an attendee. Once the service is autonomous, do you envision that it will replace paratransit services, or will the cost be prohibitive to those kinds of door-to-door services?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We aspire to complement all other kinds of public transit. Goal number one is to get people out of private cars. Paratransit has obviously the very light footprint and flexibility to go where it's needed. But where capacity warrants, we want to put our systems to then free up those systems that are serving those kind of primary corridors to deploy further into other areas of the community.
Kind of along those lines of, who is this for? We have another question about, is it a single rider system, or will there be space for families or couples?
So as you can see in the image on the screen, that is effectively 2 coach seats side by side. And each vehicle, because they're bidirectional, has 2 sides of this. So it's mirrored that. So effectively a family of 4 fits comfortably. In fact, if you've got a stroller with the kid, mom and 2 other kids, you fit very comfortably. In fact, a family of 4 adults that know each other well is fine. But the real kind of underlying strategy there is to eliminate the interim stops that come with a shared vehicle, that allow us to kind of like provide the confidence of schedule and the sort of the comfort and confidence and safety of being able to kind of travel in the way you want to travel. Again, really trying to kind of supplant what people are continually gravitating to their individual automobiles to do.
And I think we have time for one more question. People are welcome to continue typing in the chat. But our final question is still along the lines of the cost. Because it sounds like you're depending on the fare box revenue to kind of balance everything out. Do you envision that there will be equity for transportation access, or how do you see that all balancing out, I guess?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways to answer that question. And I just want to say that, first of all, from a cost standpoint, the incremental cost to build out this infrastructure is drastically lower than anything else to move that many people today. And so it's much easier to kind of build more of it for every dollar that's spent. What the fare actually ends up being becomes a negotiated strategy what the community wants to do. If the community wants to provide some public funding and make it zero, that's possible. And it's between there and effectively what is cheaper than the alternative. What we want to start with is effectively matching prevailing transit fares at this point. As you can see on the screen, though, from the other side of that question is like, who can be on this? We want to make this the most accessible mode of public transit there is. As you can see with that wheelchair in the bottom central image, the vehicle is boarded at a flush level. I mean, people come into that vehicle, and because it's a dedicated individual ride, you can take your time in getting going before you signal you want to leave the station. And so what that does is all of a sudden it relieves people from that stress. And again, in interviewing people in accessibility surveys and focus groups, it's that stress and pressure from others in a shared vehicle that really dissuades them from using it. So we really want to make this the ideal experience for the widest range of people.
Well, thank you so much for that, Paul. We really appreciate your focus to attention. There is one more question in the chat if you'd like to, in the Q&A portion of our Zoom, if you'd like to type there.
Sure.
We really appreciate the visuals and hope to see more from you guys soon. Paul's information will be also shared at the end so people can reach out to him and ask more about the progress of Glideways. Thank you so much, Paul. We appreciate your time.
thank you very much for your attention today. Look forward to anybody who wants to get in touch and answering any more questions you might have. Thanks very much again.
Okay, so now I will share my screen and introduce our next speaker. We have Evan Golden of Parkade. He's the CEO and founder, and he'll be sharing with us a little bit about their services. Evan, thank you so much for joining us. You should now have access to share your screen if you'd like to present.
Perfect. Great. Sorry, Zoom is just covering up a button. Perfect. Can you see that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to chat about parking. So it's what I live and breathe, and I'm excited to tell you guys about what we do. So before I get started, I'm the CEO and founder of Parkade. We've been around for about 4 years, work with buildings all around the world, and we are an app-based parking management system that buildings use to park more cars in fewer spots with software only. There's no hardware, there's no stackers. We are a software platform that buildings use to make parking work better for everybody. And I'm excited about today's topic because as parking requirements hopefully fall and developers have more free reign to build the right amount of parking for them, well, that's going to beg the question of how much parking is enough. Once the city isn't requiring it, how do developers actually ensure that if they build less parking, they will be able to rent out all of their units, or they will be able to fill their office space? The most important part of that equation is how parking is managed. So I'm going to take a couple minutes, about 5 minutes, to tell you about how that's usually done today. And then I'm going to take a couple minutes to tell you about how it can be done in a much better way with Parkade. So there's usually 3 different approaches that buildings take to managing parking. When I say buildings, it could be a residential building, a commercial building, a mixed-use building. There's 3 different approaches. The most common is that a building self-manages their parking, right? If you've lived in a big apartment building, your property manager might be in charge of your parking, and they're doling out the spots. That's what we call self-managed parking. Some buildings might outsource parking. It's a tricky solution. It's not used very often. It's mainly just used, maybe in downtown San Jose. You might have an apartment building that just hands over their entire parking garage to Laz Parking or someone like that. They put in a pay gate. The building loses really all control over parking, and the kind of parking operator just leases parking to whoever pays the most money, and it's open to the public. That's generally the kind of outsourced solution. It's not used very often, but it is a little bit. And a very common solution, especially in San Jose, especially with offices, is what I just call hope and pray. You put up a tenant parking sign, you hope for the best, you leave it at that. And that's certainly something, especially I grew up in the South Bay, something that is used very commonly in Silicon Valley. But we specifically have built something that helps buildings self-manage their parking in a new way. And I'll get into that more. But if you are a building, if you're a developer or a property manager or a facilities manager that's put in charge of parking at your building and you're managing it yourself, you generally have 2 choices to make. You can decide to do assigned parking, or you can do unassigned parking. They both have a lot of benefits. They both have a lot of drawbacks. And we'll get into it, but we've really created a system that combines the benefits of both of those into one. If a building does assign parking, that's generally what especially residential buildings like to do. Residents like having, when you get home from your shift at work, you like knowing where you're going to park. Highly reliable. It's something you'll often even pay more for. You'll pay more for than an unassigned parking spot. But it does mean a big hit to parking utilization. It means that parking spots are going to sit empty when not in use. Additionally, most buildings that self-manage parking don't have a great process to do it. They might make you sign a paper lease. They might make you come into an office during business hours. They might, in some cases, even make you pay by check on a monthly basis. That's very common, and it's a very analog process that just makes parking tough for tenants. And it means that, when your guest comes to visit, there's no way for them to park on site. It means that you have a work truck to park just for a week. There's no way to get an extra spot just for a couple of days, which means you're going to be parking down the street and annoying your neighbors. The buildings that do self-manage their parking, often have to create their own homespun tools to do so. They're gonna, and we see this kind of thing all the time, create, some massive spreadsheet of who's parking where. It's really cumbersome, it's hard to use, it's hard to train people on. And if the building charges for parking, which is pretty tough if you're managing parking through a spreadsheet, you're gonna likely have parking assignments living in one system and parking billing living in an entire another system. And that, again, makes parking really tough for people to use. Even your own tenants, guests, staff, it just becomes something that's really hard to access. So buildings have a lot of empty parking. That's the result from systems like this, is your residential spots, your long-term parking are going to sit empty sometime for days between tenants, sometimes for weeks or months. And that's very common. And that's why it's very common to see buildings that are fully leased on parking only have 50% of the spots actually occupied. And visitor parking generally becomes an afterthought at best. It's hard for buildings to manage. It's very hard for them to monetize if they're not, outsourcing their entire parking operation, and therefore becomes very unreliable for residents, right? It becomes a reason that residents don't like living at the property, is it's hard for guests to come visit. Enforcement, also very, very difficult when your parking data lives in a spreadsheet, right? If a security guard finds an errant misparked car at midnight on a Friday, they don't have access to that spreadsheet. It's very difficult for them to do. Some buildings literally deputize residents to tow cars, and the resident has to sit there for an hour waiting for a tow truck. Other buildings, if they get a parking complaint, they say, wink, wink, yeah, we'll get right on that. And then they do nothing because they're scared to act. They're worried that they're going to tow a resident's car. So enforcement is very difficult in this world, and really towing is the only solution. So in summary, on the traditional approach, self-managed parking just doesn't really work very well and ends up with a lot of vacancy. And it ends up with buildings feeling like they're really short on parking, even though there's a ton of idle capacity. And that's why we created a new system. We created Parkade, which is an app-based parking management system. And what Parkade primarily delivers are 4 things. And I'm going to focus on capacity, but I wanted to mention that we also deliver revenue enhancements, time savings for staff, amenity value for residents or for commercial office tenants who all of a sudden have much easier time parking or reporting issues at their property. And here's how we deliver it. We create an app-based parking management system that's self-serve for buildings, tenants, guests, visitors, the public, whoever they want. And it removes property managers, it removes facilities managers as the bottleneck to getting parking. And that's really key. It makes it possible for a building to set their preferences, their prices, their requirements, and enable people parking at the building to use Parkade to get parking whenever they need it. Additionally, core to our system is the belief that no parking spot needs to sit empty. So when a building adopts Parkade, if and only if they allow long-term rentals at the property, residents or commercial office tenants can put their spots back in the pool when they're not using them. And that's really key, and something residents that use us love, property managers love, facilities managers love, is the idea that people can have their long-term parking spot, they can have that reliable spot. But when they're, off visiting relatives for a week, they can put that spot back in the pool. And that opportunity cost, even at a property that doesn't charge for parking, is absolutely massive and totally game-changing. Enforcement is also just much, much easier in our world. Everybody just uses Parkade, and if someone's parked in their spot, they report the issue in the app. We find them a new authorized space to park in seconds. We notify the vehicle owner if we know who it is. Our 24/7 customer service team is able to engage if we don't know whose vehicle that is. Essentially, we move from a world where towing is the action of first and only resort to one where we can actually find and notify people. We don't have to resort to towing just because you parked in the wrong spot because you were really tired one night. So that's been really exciting for people. And the system works whether a building wants to proactively enforce their parking or whether they just want to leave it to residents or commercial office tenants to report issues. Additionally, Parkade is built to be private by default. So from the ground up, everything is built so that it can be private and just for tenants, staff, and guests if desired. And that's the way we recommend it if the building has a gate. But if the building doesn't have a gate, we are able to allow the building to actually lease out spots back to the public as well. So that's been really helpful for some buildings that definitely have excess parking. Lastly, kind of core to our system is the concept that we'll handle all parking billing. So whether it's someone renting a spot for 25 cents for an hour or $250 for a month, all of that money is handled by our system and doesn't have to flow through different systems that the building may use. We'll work whether the building wants to charge for parking or not. We have lots of buildings that don't charge for parking, and that's totally fine. But we do make it very easy for buildings to charge. And we handle all the payments, whether that's paying the building at the end of each month or paying, Evan because I loaned out my spot yesterday for $10. As a real world example, we launched at a building run by Greystar, one of the largest property management companies in the world, in Los Angeles back in early January. And this was a great case study on the impact of better managed parking. There's a building called Mariposa on 3rd in an area of LA called Koreatown that has pretty tough parking. It's not right downtown, it's kind of downtown adjacent. And they have 128 units, 140 parking spots, but some of those spots are staff and retail parking. So a little bit less than a 1-to-1 parking ratio. And we saw a massive uplift at this property. Before Parkade launched there, the property managers were tearing their hair out. They were losing leases. Residents were being turned away because they literally didn't have parking for people. People would move in and they would say, we'll have parking for you in a couple of weeks, we hope. And so they were short on parking. After Parkade, they now have 16 extra long-term parking spaces, so many that they're actually going to be leasing a bunch of those out to a restaurant on a long-term basis. Additionally, parking utilization, which is the percent of cars occupying a parking spot at peak hours. So this was done late evenings on weekdays, went from about 48% to 61%. So huge increase in the number of cars that were able to park at the property. And that got us big accolades from the property management team, who can finally sign leases without stressing. Additionally, I want to mention that this works in any, I want to say any type of property, but most types of property, whether there's a gate or no gate, doesn't matter. Multifamily, residential, apartment building, mixed use, commercial. We have commercial tenants. Senior center right next to my elementary school in Palo Alto is one of our first commercial customers. So this can work in any kind of building as long as there is limited parking. There's likely a need for parkade. And surface structured parking doesn't really matter as long as it's not just a single family home subdivision. There's probably a need for parkade. We also, I'm not going to go into these in depth on these, but we also deliver real-time and historical data on parking usage, which is really helpful, especially I know there's some developers in the audience. Knowing how much parking is actually being used at all of your developments on both a real-time and historical basis and at what prices is really important when you're trying to plan your next building. A lot of buildings with these systems kind of being haphazard don't have great data on what parking usage looks like. We do, and it's very easy to see and deliver. We also make EV much more palatable and easier to implement, cheaper to implement. As an example, I own an EV, but I do not have an EV charger in my parking spot. I charged my car in my neighbor's parking spot last night that I paid her $5 to borrow and then paid for the electricity. And so I don't have to install a charger in my own spot. It also could work for communal parking and making EV charging very much more reliable. And this can also really help with what we call shared parking across different uses. What I hate to see is an office building that's built 100 parking spaces, with a bunch of residential on site that also has 100 parking spaces. That should really be shared, right? We shouldn't have these disparate uses requiring a massive extra amount of asphalt. So that's really what we're about, and happy to answer any questions. If anyone's interested, please send us a note at hello@parkade.com. We're not only looking for more buildings to work with, but we're also hiring. So let us know.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Evan. Great information. So happy to see you tackling this challenge, especially in our really populated area. I think we've all had our own struggles with parking, so I'm excited to hear more. I think for me, one clarifying question would be, can you go into an already developed housing or office building and implement your system with what already exists?
Oh yeah, 100%. Most of our customers, not all, but most of our customers are buildings that were already existing. Mariposa on Third, for example, we went in and took all of their parking data, imported it all to our system, and we have a really nice flow where anyone that has an existing parking lease or existing parking assignment with that building downloads our app and is instantly shown their spot right in our system to confirm. So we work with, I'd say 80-90% of buildings are already existing. 10 to 20% are lease ups and brand new.
Okay. And I know you said that installation of equipment or towers isn't really necessary, but what are some of the startup costs or some of the startup processes that you have to go through?
Yeah, we generally, unless a site visit is needed, which it usually is not, although in some cases it has been, there are generally no startup costs. So we're just pricing this based on, we have small nominal monthly fees. And then if and when there is money exchanged for a parking space, we take a small slice of that as well. So there's no massive upfront fees. This is something that's very, very affordable for buildings to use. And one of the things they love the most about Parkade.
And so the fees that you mentioned, are those paid by the apartment or are those paid by the individuals who join your system?
It's paid by the building. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Although it's up to the building, right? The building could decide to, maybe they raise prices slightly because we're going to be charging a small fee. Other buildings have lowered prices. We generally are offered, the way this can play out for tenants is often just much smarter pricing. We come into a lot of buildings where parking is $100 a month. Doesn't matter if it's the 5th floor down below the garage or a compact spot or a huge spot, right next to the elevator. It's $100 a month. Often we'll come in and make our recommendations and end up doing something like, we recommend that parking now be $75 to $125 and give people a much wider range to choose from. So the tenant impact or the resident impact is generally pretty good for them. Plus they're able to sublease their spot. But yeah, generally the costs are borne by the building.
Nice, thank you. And we do have a question from an attendee. What is the typical percentage increase or decrease of the parking stalls as a result of Parkade usage?
Yeah, good question. I would say it's hard to answer because most of the buildings that we go into don't instantly then tear down their parking spaces. So I would say the best way to answer that question might be that we see usually a 5 to 15% increase in parking utilization. What the building does with their parking spots totally varies. Some buildings we are seeing are redeveloping those extra parking spaces into additional housing or additional office or green space. Other buildings are just saying, I like that, guests and the public can now park here. I'm just going to keep all this parking in place. So it really varies, but we give buildings a lot more options by allowing them to get a lot more out of their parking.
Yeah, so it sounds like Parkade might be able to fill in a little bit of that data gap that Eric mentioned at the beginning about, how much parking is needed. It sounds like the developers don't always have that data on hand. So that's something that maybe your services provide. What kind of data sharing do you go through with your clients?
Yeah, so they are able to see real-time and historical data on usage, on revenue, on who's parking where from kind of a day-to-day basis. And they're really able to get a better sense of how their parking is used. We've seen, when you're managing parking in an Excel spreadsheet, it can be tough to figure out if the spreadsheet you're looking at actually matches reality. We've had a property manager told me that before they used to lease out their parking spaces, they would walk down to the garage and double check that no one was actually parked in that spot because they were never sure that they'd gotten it right. So this gives them the confidence that their parking data is actually accurate and it's being constantly audited rather than living in a spreadsheet and then having it get out of date and having to pay someone to come in and do a parking audit every 6 months. They're able to see really everything they need from utilization to revenue. It's all there kind of at their fingertips. We have a nice web dashboard for them and we send out monthly reports as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think we have time for one more question. We have someone submitted a question through the Q&A and it's a two-part one. You kind of answered it already about, how do you provide that data? But also, how do you capture that data? Do users, have to log in every time they use a parking space and kind of convey that to you? Or what is the mechanism there?
No, they're not logging in. I mean, unless they might log in and book a parking space through our system for 3 hours, but they're just logging in that once. So we're capturing the data just based on leasing, right? What we're doing is capturing leasing data in a much smarter way. So we're not making them check into the parking space or check out of the parking space or anything like that. We're just enabling them to lease spots in a much, much easier self-serve manner.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Evan. Really appreciate all of the information that you've been provided. Thank you so much. Alex, just let me know that we're running a little bit behind, so definitely trying to stick to the schedule as much as possible. Thank you so much to all of the presenters so far. Up next, we have Krista. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you to tell you a little bit more about her. Krista Glosbach, please correct me if I'm wrong, is the Western U.S. Partnerships for VIA. And she's going to be sharing a little bit about their services, a little bit about her role there, and introducing us to VIA. Thank you so much, Krista. You should have control to share your screen now.
Great, there we go. It's Glotzbach, and I'm always told I talk too fast, so I'm going to get us right back on time. VIA is a transit technology company. So we partner mostly with cities, transit agencies, corporations, universities, and developers in order to build custom transportation solutions. As you can see in this picture, we have 600 of these partners around the world. So any of these cities that you go visit, you can use an application, some probably branded to that city or agency. You can go to Cupertino, the city of Cupertino, for example, download VIA in Cupertino, and take a shared ride from one point to another in the city for, in Cupertino's case, $4. So these are custom transit systems, very often using kind of a minivan-sized vehicle, delivering shared rides in cooperation with the public transit in the region. The different types of things we do are microtransit, on-demand transit, with which, 3 years ago at a thing like this, people wouldn't necessarily know what I would mean, and I have to explain that in detail, but now it's gotten much more common and people understand what a customized microtransit system would look like. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. We also do paratransit systems all over the world. We do school buses. Some of the vehicles by which we deliver this microtransit or on demand are autonomous. A lot of them are electric. And we have these services that are built for employers. And I'll show you some of the ones that we work with here in the Bay Area. I think everyone is familiar now with shared ride microtransit, but it works like this. There are virtual stops, which is virtually any corner, but the virtual stop concept is that there will be places that people can walk to that are very close by within a block or two, but that will facilitate these shared rides to help these vehicles not have to go so far off course. And so passengers walk a short way to their vehicle. There might be a neighbor in the vehicle already. They'll get in the vehicle and then will get dropped off with as little detour as possible and as high a quality service as possible. It works very much like applications you have used to get to a ride from point A to point B, but they are much more custom applications in that our partners, be it the city of Cupertino or Sacramento Regional Transit, are deciding how it works and how it complements public transit. For example, if we were working with you and VTA was a contributor to the service that we were both providing in a region, VTA might say, well, if someone is standing right by a bus stop and they order a vehicle going somewhere the bus is going, let's ask them to please ride the bus. So the solution would give them a proposal that was for a direct, bus line instead of a car that would come pick them up. So it can be integrated with public transit such that it works to complement the system and get more people onto public transit instead of cannibalizing public transit at all. Specifically, when we're working with developers, there are some things that are key to what they typically care about. One is that these are completely customized transit systems, and I'll go through a couple examples after this. But in this example with Google, they brand the cars as Via to G. In these other two examples, I don't have a picture, but the cars are typically branded by the service, and the application looks very much like the service. So if we're helping you create a customized transportation solution, it can carry through the brand that you are looking to carry through. We have a partner in Florida, for example, that uses only Teslas for their service because they want to convey a very high-end experience for their specific service and a very high-end brand. So it really is up to the partner how they want to communicate that brand, and it's their service to build and customize. Also, for certain developments, we can really help, as everyone on this call, we're looking to help minimize the need to build additional parking. If we can help people get from point A to point B in a way that they find extremely convenient and they're being picked up at their door or at the nearby corner, we can help reduce the amount of demand for a personal vehicle and public cars, and other types of transit. We've done studies in places like West Sacramento, and we can show nominal, not massive, but people will say that they now opt to use these instead of buying a vehicle in places where we now have been established for a couple of years. This is definitely a solution that can scale. Another thing I'll point out about our deployment with Google, this map shows when Google deployed VIA for its employees, the order in which it deployed and grew the service. So it started with a service for Google employees that was in this zone 1, where you could get people to and from campus. And then as demand grew and as it was established, and we knew exactly what kind of parameters to have for the service, it grew more and more and is a very successful service for them. But it's easy to incrementally add over time based on the success of the service. Meeting your environmental goals, services like this are a great way to bring in EVs. We're talking about vehicles that exist today, minivans. We use PHEVs in several of our services. We can use smaller electric vehicles, but they can be brought on now and they can be brought on over time. The fleets can vary in what's used, so that we can really start to address climate concerns right away. This allows us also to take advantage of a lot of grants here in California. There are a lot of grants available for this type of transportation if you're able to use electric vehicles. So this type of service makes it quite affordable to be able to incorporate electric vehicles into a mobility solution. We also typically are partnering with public sector partners. So these short shared rides that we are giving, we are working with the public transit agency, with the cities, and we're proving reduced VMT, reduced congestion by using surveys, by using real data about miles on the road, and by looking at how many people are sharing rides so that we can show how we are helping remove that impact on the environment. So the couple of examples I have that I've flipped to a couple times now, Google has used us for several years to help employees that live in the immediate area of Google get to work in shared rides. This means that people, about 7% in a survey that they did and published, said that they no longer take their single occupancy vehicle to work. Instead, they take a VIA shared ride and then don't need to park on campus. Google is expanding now to other cities and regions in the US, Canada, and further afield to other campuses because it has been so effective to help them reduce the need for parking and to increase how many people are taking shared rides to work every day. There are several other companies that also use us in the Bay that you have heard of. And one of them is using us in a 230 square mile zone. It's quite expansive. And they use this service to help people either on demand or in these pre-scheduled rides come with other employees in shared rides to work in the Bay. Cupertino, I've mentioned earlier. This is a service that we have that's in the boundaries of Cupertino. Basically, 57% of people there told us that if they weren't riding in a VIA right then, they would have been driving their own car. So we are taking people out of those single occupancy vehicles, and it's proven in the surveys that we do in various places across California and elsewhere. So that's an important statistic that we like to talk about because that is our point, to help people get into public transit or get them into a shared ride in general. And then Park City, Utah, I'll bring up because it's again a highly custom system that we helped build for the region. Summit County was creating their own transit agency and looked to VIA initially our strategies team to help them devise what the transit system could look like, and then deploy an integrated system that has microtransit, paratransit, and fixed route, all integrated in one application that riders in the region can take anywhere in the overall area. So if you visit Park City and you stay in one of the neighborhoods and you want to go ski at Park City Mountain, you can take an on-demand vehicle from High Valley Transit, it's called, which is a via service that gets you in shared rides to where you need to go. Most riders, including here, these services usually get set up to help people get to work and jobs. So it's not set up just for tourists. It's often set up to help people that don't have great access otherwise to get where they need to go. So the services are mostly, I think 40% of our riders have an income of 25K or below. And so we're often helping people get where they need to be in places where public transit doesn't typically reach them. So as I said, I speak fast. I hope I helped get us back on time, and I'd love to help take your questions.
Awesome. You stuck right within your slot. Thank you so much, Krista. We appreciate that. Thank you so much for the materials you presented with us. I think they were very informative, and I love the animations. Very engaging. Thank you again for that. I think one question that I have, and it echoes on something that I've said to the other speakers, how can developers and how can local stakeholders help support the implementation of your services and help address the issues that you've identified?
So we've engaged with developers in many different ways. The partnerships themselves are often with the city or transit agency, but as with all public transit services, there are different ways that these are funded. They're funded by the agency, by public, by taxes. Sometimes private companies, as we've mentioned, are supporting these services. So there's a lot of different ways that we can help work out and supplement the funding for it. Farebox alone will not take care of the whole cost of these services. So we work with developers to partner with the communities, with the transit agencies to determine what region we can build these services out in and design that service. Rocio, your mute is on.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Just letting everyone know that as we kind of move forward through the agenda, people are still welcome to submit questions for you, Krista, via the chat function or via the Q&A function. We'll also have a brief Q&A towards the end, but for now, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much, Krista. We really appreciate the information you shared with us and are excited to see your services expand into our communities. Up next, let me share my screen while Ulrich gets ready. So today we have Arik Ohana, the president and founder of Envoy. He is going to be telling us a little bit about them. And Arik, looks like you're ready. Are you able to share your screen?
Let me try. It says I can't share screen while others are participating.
Okay, let me stop my share. Give it a try.
Perfect. Now it works. Let me know when everybody sees my screen.
Okay, we see it.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for the time today. This is actually one of my favorite topics. We actually started this company based on these issues, trying to solve a problem. As mentioned, I'm a co-founder and president of Envoy. But prior to starting Envoy about 5 years ago, I spent about 10 years in real estate. Everything from institutional asset management to ground up development of multifamily and student housing. And while we were actually doing a student housing development in Texas, we actually had an issue where the city was requiring us to build way more parking than we knew we actually needed for this student housing development. So we were looking at ways to actually reduce parking in an effective way that wasn't going to, hurt tenants. And one of the other issues we were faced with is we really wanted to create amenities within our community that didn't take up a lot of square footage, didn't cost a lot of money to implement, and potentially could actually add to somebody's lifestyle, some way reduce their cost of living. So about 5 years ago, we started Envoy, and we provide a service that we call e-mobility as an amenity. So this is car sharing that is exclusive for communities. So you're actually sharing vehicles with your next door neighbor versus the general public or just a city. All of our vehicles are parked on site at a convenient parking space, and all of our vehicles are all electric. So what we provide is an exclusive electric car sharing solution for mainly apartments, but also hotels and workplaces. There's three major components of our platform and program. We have a full service mobile app that allows people to register, reserve, and actually unlock vehicles directly through their phone. We also have a full fleet of EVs, everything from Teslas on the more luxury side down to like Chevy Bolts and Nissan Leafs on the more economical side. Each one of our vehicles includes insurance for the driver and for the property owner, roadside assistance, as well as a data platform that we provide data to developers and property owners on these programs. And we also maintain and wash these vehicles on a regular basis. In addition, we also do building electrification. So we're installing dedicated chargers for each one of our vehicles. And we could also, just a note, we could also utilize existing chargers that might be on site, but we can come in there and come with a strategy on electrifying your building, whether that's 10 parking spaces and one shared vehicle, or even more than that. And the technology we've developed is really to integrate the electrification component and the shared mobility together. So residents only need one app to access a charger or access mobility. So as I mentioned, we've been in operation for about 5 years now. We're in about 180 communities across the US, focused in major urban areas. We have over 200 electric vehicles, done over 100,000 bookings, and have driven nearly 3 million e-miles now. So we now work with some of the major regional and national ownership groups in the country, including many of them are mentioned here, but some of them are not. So again, we've actually solved this kind of amenity need, this really nice thing to have a car parked downstairs from your doorstep or for outside your elevator lobby. This really enables people to actually get rid of their vehicle altogether, or just go down from a 2-car family to a 1-car family. So this is actually a real solution if you need to reduce parking, but you're concerned that your residents aren't going to have access to cars and it might make your property unmarketable. But beyond just being a great amenity, what we've actually seen in the last 5 years is this is a great tool to attract and retain tenants. So, rent an apartment and get a Tesla is a great tagline to get somebody into a property tour, but it actually gets people to sign leases. And once they start actually using this service, it keeps them in a building longer. So our users stay on a building almost 2 times longer than the average rollover of a building. And unlike other amenities, there's actually a measurable effectiveness. We can actually track the ROI of this amenity. And as mentioned, these are exclusive just for residents of the building, so you can maintain a secure parking garage, as well as actually achieve up to 3 LEED certification points. So if you're aiming for green building certification, this actually helps you achieve that. And for residents and tenants, obviously, there's a lot of value add here. This is more affordable than owning a car, but is more flexible than renting a car or other shared mobility services, and is more convenient, right? Like it's parked at your doorstep. You don't actually have to go find that mode of transportation or take another mode of transportation to rent this vehicle. It's on site. And it also fits into that, the green consciousness. What we see is about 85% of our users, the first time they drive an electric vehicle is on our platform. So it's really helping achieve that EV adoption that we're all striving for. So this idea of car-free living, there's the ability of going into an existing property and helping reduce car ownership in a building. But the other extreme is actually designing a building that has no residential parking and all revolves around shared mobility. So we're about to launch out a project in Tempe, Arizona, which is a very car-centric area. But this developer is developing over 700 apartment units with 0 residential parking. Actually, residents are contractually obligated not to own a vehicle on site. And the only way they can actually do this without making their building unmarketable is providing them the mobility that they need to achieve this, right? And what I mentioned before, when we were trying to reduce parking on that student housing development, we were successfully reducing parking requirement by 50%. And it saved us $8 million in hard costs or construction costs for not building that parking. Those savings, when actually applied into putting mobility on site, is a no-brainer. It's a much easier investment to make into mobility than to build parking that in the future might not be used. And we mentioned, a solution for residential communities, car-free living initiatives, so exclusive vehicles just for the residents. But we also work with the Irvine Company and many office buildings where they're promoting not coming to work in a single occupancy vehicle, utilizing public transit, carpooling, walking, biking, but having on-site vehicles that people can use for a business meeting or an emergency or a guaranteed ride home. And we're also working with resorts and hotels where people can skip the rental car line, they can get to their hotel using Lyft, but then have a car on demand if they want to go sightseeing or do other things. So really the best of both worlds. And when you compare Envoy to other amenities, even like a pool or a gym, the construction cost to build a pool or a gym is pretty hefty, and it takes up a lot of square footage. And there's an ongoing OpEx cost, right? You have utilities for the pool, you got a pool cleaner, you got FF&E that you have to replace every 5 to 10 years. There's that ongoing cost. For Envoy, for the mobility component, there's typically just a startup fee of about $2,500. And through our revenue share, the net cost for a property, even for a Tesla, is only a few $100s a month. So it's super economical, but provides all these additional value adds to both the real estate developer and to the community members. So just to touch on how our program works, a property gets to choose what vehicles they want on site. They're committing to a 3-year period for these vehicles to be on site. They're paying a monthly fee that includes the vehicle, insurance, maintenance, car washes. It's all in turnkey. And then for every minute that a resident uses the vehicle, they're renting to use that vehicle. And we're splitting that revenue 50-50 with the property. So essentially, this becomes a very low cost amenity immediately. And as time goes on, this can even achieve positive revenue. And just to touch on a few other things, since we're talking about mobility and electrification, I think we're all kind of on the same page that the future of mobility will be electric. More than likely it will be shared, but it'll also need to be convenient. The one thing that we aren't talking about in the industry is how is that going to be integrated with building systems? So today, commercial real estate is not ready for the energy demand needed to power tomorrow's mobility. So a lot of where we focus and our technology's focus is how do we integrate the electric vehicle into building systems? So our technology that operates these electric fleets, as well as the EV chargers, are tied into the energy management systems of the building, ensuring that we are charging these vehicles at the most economical time, hopefully the time that the most sustainable energy like wind and solar is available, which typically is actually the cheapest rates that the buildings are paying. And then when the buildings are paying a higher rate of energy, the ability to not charge vehicles. And in some pilots that we're running, we're actually able to take the energy in the vehicles and push it back into the building. And this is really super important. I mean, right now, electric vehicles make up 2% of the marketplace, if that. But by 2030, about 30% to 40% of all new vehicles sold in the US will be electric. And real estate, especially multifamily, are going to become the fuel stations of tomorrow. So knowing what that strategy is and having the proper infrastructure is super important. So again, our technology really focuses in on a plug and play EV fleet solution that ties into buildings. And the data that we're collecting from these services is really providing localized mobility behavior, not mobility needs on a city level, but really on a community level. And that data is actually informing developers on exactly what they need in these buildings. And they're able to take this data and go to planning and zoning and city council and get parking reductions and other development incentives, including density bonuses as well. And a lot of the work that we've done has also been within disadvantaged and affordable communities. So even if there's that type of requirement, that's something that we're very good at understanding the mobility needs and providing solutions for those communities. So I know we're running low on time, so I'm going to end it there. If you have any additional questions or want to discuss further, feel free to email me directly at arik@envoythere.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Arik. I think you tackled a lot of the questions that I've been asking presenters about, the costs and the some of the challenges and, how the relationship with the developers works. So you covered most of my bases here. If anyone has any questions for Arik and specifically, please submit them via the chat or the Q&A. In the meantime, I'd love to ask you a little bit about how this compares to the competition, right? Where is it that you see the innovation of Envoy?
Yeah, I mean, number one, we started off as being a solely electric fleet. So everything that we have in our tool basket revolves around electric vehicles and how they're connected to building systems. The other thing is, unlike some of the other competitors in car sharing that are more generally open to the public, we have the ability of matching the vehicle type to the community type. So in a luxury property, we're providing luxury vehicles, and more student housing, more economical living, we're providing more economical vehicles. So matching the mobility type to the community type is something I think unique. And again, our perspective from coming from the real estate industry and being developers ourselves, we are able to actually help developers come up with a plan and again, present to planning and zoning or city council on that plan with data behind it.
Okay, I think, environmental sustainability is something that a lot of us here feel passionately about. So I'm so excited to hear about that mission alignment with your services. Thank you so much, Arik, for sharing with us. We really appreciate your time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and point out that we've now reached 4:45, which was the official end time for our event today. We would like to present an opportunity for people to submit more questions and kind of reach out to our speakers for a few more minutes, but if they're available to stick around. But in the meantime, I would like to share my screen with all of you and do a couple of my closing remarks so that in case people do need to leave now. First of all, thank you everyone for attending today and, sharing information and sharing thoughts with our speakers. We think this is a really valuable conversation that hopefully will carry on to all of your work in the community. If anyone is interested in continuing to engage with Catalyze SV's committees or services, we have our community engagement committee information here, as well as our project advocacy committee information. We meet monthly in order to kind of tackle some of the more complex topics and really get insight from our community members on these issues. You're also welcome to sign up for our newsletter or donate to Catalyze SV. We also are present on most social media platforms. Our event today was live on Facebook. We regularly share on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and we will also be posting the recording of this video on YouTube following the event. So you're welcome to share that with your partners and contacts as well. And then here is our contact information for today's presenters. As you heard from them, they're open to engaging with you on these topics and sharing more information about the services they provide. Some of them also shared their general information emails. Please use those where appropriate as well. I'll give you a second to take a look at these. And then lastly, you're welcome to stay connected with Alex and myself as well. We're here to keep you engaged with important topics around development challenges and how to build collaborative efforts to tackle those challenges and find solutions as a community. Okay, and again, anyone who would like to stick around and ask more questions of our speakers, we will keep the Zoom open until 5 p.m. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us. And so far, we still have Evan, Krista, Paul here. If anybody has any, and Arik as well, if anybody has anything else they'd like to share or comment now, please take this as a networking opportunity. And I'll leave this page up.
Thank you very much. That was terrific.
Thank you, Paul.
Everybody.
Thanks again, Minetta Transportation Institute and Transform for supporting tonight.
So it seems like we have one question for you, Paul. Does Glideways have a set of fixed stops, or can riders get on and off anywhere along the line?
Yeah, one of the factors that comes with the protected guideways, we establish what we call access points along the way. But because the vehicles are small, the access points are also small. The vehicles come down to grade level at the streets. So this is something that basically comes about through a planning process, interacting with sort of existing planning, the existing context, and the future sort of demands for the community. So they are fixed, what others would call stations.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Paul, and for the question, Curtis.
I loved the variety of concepts, how they're different, but also overlapping that you all presented today. It was just fantastic. And even though it was tough, as one of you told me, you all did a great job presenting in probably a shorter period of time than you would like. So appreciate getting that tight pitch down. I know we all need it. I have to do pitches like that too. So thank you everyone for doing that.
Yeah, I also commend all of you for taking on the challenge of, engaging with the community on their needs and doing assessments and data analyses about, the actual usage of the spaces and the diversity of the populations that are going to use your services. It's always great when partners think ahead on community engagement.
Any questions the panelists want to ask each other? Is that too crazy?
Okay. Well, I think if there's no more questions, we really appreciate everyone's time. There's still a few people lingering, but I think everyone is mostly gone. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. We'll be sharing these recordings. They'll be up on YouTube soon. And again, thank you so much to our speakers and our sponsors. Everyone have a great evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for
Thanks
organizing,
again. Look
folks.
forward to the next one.
Thanks, Evan.
Bye
Thanks,
now.
Paul. Thanks, Krista. Thanks, Eric. Great
Thank
job,
you.
Rocio. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.